Now I want to begin with the story of a boy named James Leininger. Starting from the age of 2, this little boy would scream something his parents could not understand. The plane is on fire. The man can't get out. The plane is falling into the water. As soon as he turned 2, he was given some toy airplanes, and he would always show the same movement, how the plane nosedived into the water, falling, falling, falling. He was haunted by nightmares, drawing the same picture again and again, a crashing plane, Japanese ships. He played with these toys, and by the time he was 3, he had already begun naming other details from this strange nightmare that kept pursuing him. He said the word Natoma, then he said the name Jack Larson. He stated that he had been a downed pilot from an aircraft carrier called Natoma. He revealed his name from a previous life, and he identified the model and number of the plane he had flown in that past life. His father, a devout Christian and a complete skeptic, did everything he could to drive out what he believed to be the devil's spirit from the boy. In his view, this simply could not be true, because such things could never happen. It was only when the boy turned 4 that he and his wife began to take notes and truly listen to what their son was saying.
Intimidated by the process at first. Scared may not be quite the right word, but the issue of proving or identifying facts involving what James had to say had a lot of starts and stops to it. It wasn't one smooth process. There were times where a piece of information took a year and a half to find an answer to. At one point, when I realized that this involved reincarnation, I almost regretted starting the process because I was afraid that I'd prove myself wrong.
And so the boy said that in his past life his name was James Houston Jr., and that he, James Houston Jr., had been shot down in battle over Iwo Jima at the age of 21. He drew the silhouette of the mountain over which he had been shot down. He mentioned the names of his fellow servicemen. Further investigation of all the statements the boy had made at the age of 4, to everyone's astonishment, turned out to be completely accurate. Everything the boy said, despite having been born 53 years after the pilot's death, was confirmed as soon as his parents began consulting archives and obtaining official records. Everything he spoke about, his development, his drawings, his nightmares, his ramblings, his sessions with doctors who tried to treat him, was all documented on videotape. And his meeting with the veterans, as well as his meeting with the woman who was allegedly his sister from a previous life, were recorded on film. Everything was documented, and every detail he mentioned matched exactly. The type of plane and its modification, the F-4U Corsair, was confirmed. The ship he called Natoma turned out to be the USS Natoma Bay, which was also confirmed. The serviceman the boy repeatedly mentioned, the close friend of the fallen pilot Jack Larson, was likewise confirmed. The place of death near Mount Suribachi by Iwo Jima was confirmed. The boy had drawn the silhouette of this mountain many times, and this too was verified. The plane had been hit in the engine by an enemy fighter. The pilot could not escape and burned as the plane went down. This was confirmed by eyewitnesses. The age at which the pilot, the previous James Jr., had died was also verified. 21 years old. What was astonishing was that the boy would sign many of his drawings as James III. When asked why the third, he explained, "I am the third James. There was James Jr., and James Houston also had a father named James." So he was absolutely correct in calling himself James III. He recognized the family, described his sister, described the house where they both grew up, mentioned a picture that had been given to him as a gift, and recalled many details that only members of Houston's family could have known before he went off to war. He shared a unique technical detail, that the landing gear of this particular aircraft model retracted sideways, and the entire chronology of the life of the fallen James Houston was recounted by him with complete accuracy. There is not the slightest doubt about it. All of this was examined by a number of medical experts and published in a medical report that appeared in a fully professional medical journal. James Leininger, born in April 1998, is now an adult. He is a programmer, a pilot, and he develops simulator systems and virtual testing systems for aircraft. Aviation became his profession. His story has been verified by dozens of different experts. With the desire to disprove or to find some gap in this logical chain, no one was able to do this at the moment of recording this video. Everything that his parents presented, and later the doctors who worked with these parents, is fully confirmed by the video recordings, by the entries in their diaries, and so on, and two hypotheses arise. Hypothesis 1. An astonishingly strange coincidence. When a boy was born who had hallucinations that happened to match the circumstances of the life and death of a man who had died 52 years before the boy's birth. That is one hypothesis. The second hypothesis. We must admit that coincidences of this kind are statistically impossible. There are simply too many astonishing details. This would mean that the soul of the fallen James Houston Jr., or at the very least the information about his life, somehow transferred, migrated into the consciousness of this boy? The impossibility of denying this fact changes a great deal in our understanding of the world and the reality around us. And the only argument you will now tell me is, well, one case decides nothing. So what, one strange case, I would agree with you. The problem is that this is by no means a single isolated case, and the number of such documented cases to date is astonishing. So astonishing that a certain scientist, a Canadian-American psychiatrist, a child psychiatrist and the founder of a department at the University of Virginia called the Department of Perceptual Studies, collected these cases. This scientist, Ian Stevenson, born in 1918 and died in 2007, assembled more than 3,000 cases of this very strange paranormal phenomenon, which, to call things by their name, is reincarnation. Born children possessing unique knowledge and information they could not have obtained in this life and could have known only from some other previous life circumstances or situations. It should be said why this Ian Stevenson, a child psychiatrist, found himself in this strange position. From the point of view of parents whose children say, "You are not my mother, this is not my house, I have a different dog, this is not our car, this is not my sister, I want to go home, why did you take me here?" Parents of thousands of children have heard all this, and Ian Stevenson treated it as a pediatric psychiatric illness. Only when he began checking the statements made by the children, of the 3,000 cases he worked with, a little more than 2,500 were confirmed partially or completely, which we will talk about a bit later. In other words, Ian Stevenson personally collected about 2,500 cases that confirmed partially or fully the children's statements. This is very important. He published around 300 articles, and he published several books that, without a doubt, caused a sensation. And this department still exists today, continuing to study this strange and incomprehensible phenomenon. Moreover, there is a website, there is a database where you can report if you or your child experience such a strange occurrence. The data collection continues, and the count has already reached tens of thousands of documented cases, carefully recorded, with video documentation and historical references. There are so many of them that we can begin to draw certain scientific conclusions. We now have a kind of database. So in 50% of cases, reincarnation, that is the time from the date of death to the date of the child's conception, took no more than 2 years. In 90% of cases, the time from death to the child's conception was no more than 4 years. And only in 10% of cases did the interval between the date of death and the date of the child's conception stretch into decades, as in the example I gave of the 1950s. There is even a documented case where the gap spanned several centuries. But this is extremely rare. The next thing worth noting is that most children began to have these memories or strange experiences at the age of 2. But it is hard to say whether they were troubled by them earlier, since they did not speak about it. For the majority, by the age of 7 or 8, these memories completely faded, but not for everyone. In 25% of children, the memories either remained forever or persisted in some partial form. In the specific case of the boy James Leininger, whom I mentioned earlier, His memories were fully preserved into adulthood. The next observation: geographical proximity between the life and death of the previous person and their reincarnation in the child. In 70% of cases, there was very close geographical closeness between death and rebirth, less than 40 kilometers. At the same time, in the case of James Leininger, well, just look at where Iwo Jima is and where San Mateo, California is. There are cases where reincarnation occurs across the ocean and even across a different language barrier. That is, a person who died as a speaker of one language is reborn as a speaker of another. This is extremely rare, but it has happened. But a more interesting aspect is gender. In 90% of cases, gender identity remains the same. In 10% of cases, a change of gender occurs. And almost all of these children displayed transgender tendencies. That is, if the previous life was female and the child was born in a male body, pardon me, but there is no other term for it, then this man considered himself a woman and vice versa. All of them experienced discomfort with their current gender. They played with toys and clothing intended for the opposite sex, and so on. And these tendencies persisted. Most, but not all, about 70%, of the deaths were violent for one reason or another. At the same time, 30% were natural deaths, either from illness or from complications during childbirth, or simply from old age, which was also observed. But again, I emphasize that the larger share of deaths resulted from wars, disasters, and accidents. What is also interesting is that even in cases where people, as they grew older, forgot their visions, the emotional and psychological trauma remained. If a person had died in a fire, they developed the strongest phobias of fire. They were afraid to put out a flame, to light a fire, afraid to leave the house without making sure everything was turned off, and so on. In other words, intense phobias. If a person had died in water, say in a flood, they feared water and flooding. If a person had died in a car crash or another vehicle-related accident, the corresponding phobias appeared. But that is not all. Stranger and more frightening phenomena, well documented, were also observed. Namely, when a child's body retained defects corresponding to the death of the previous person. So, for example, in India, a girl was born with a unique genetic defect. One of the 2 feet of the leg did not grow. The girl said that in the previous life she died under a train. And as a result of this catastrophe, her foot of the leg was cut off. There was a boy in Africa who said that in the previous life he was shot in the back of the head. The boy had 2 birthmarks on the head, on the back of the head and at the place of the bullet exit, on the forehead. The boy, strangely enough, pointed out the place of burial where he, shot, is lying. From the previous life, everything is documented. This is not delirium. These are all references to scientific articles. You can look them up yourself. And yes, indeed, they found a skull in which there were 2 holes completely matching the birthmarks on the skin of this African boy. Further, there exist other documented defects resulting from injuries supposedly, let us keep saying supposedly, sustained by a person in their previous life. Most of these children could name their own names from before reincarnation, the names of other people, the circumstances of life, descriptions of the house, the apartment, the wife, the children, the dogs, the animals, all that surrounded them, and all that was close to their heart. Aside from the so-called strong cases, where almost everything or absolutely everything matched, there were also partial or weaker cases, which happened quite often. One such case is that of Cameron Macaulay in Scotland. The boy was born in Glasgow in 2001. In 2003, when he turned 2 years old, he began saying that in his past life he had lived on a small island not far from Scotland. He claimed that in his previous life he had been a child, that he died in a car accident, that his former father's name was Shane Robertson. He described the house where he had lived, a white house standing on the beach. Next to this house, a plane would land directly on the sand. He said he had a black and white dog, gave names, and described his brothers and sisters. He explained how he had died in a car crash, and he often longed deeply for his mother, that mother who lived on the island. He would cry, begging to return to that island, to his family. Imagine just for a moment the parents in whose home this was happening. And this was not something from the 15th century. It happened now. A child born in 2001, who today is 24 years old. Just imagine the parents who had to live with this. Naturally, the parents sought medical help, turned to psychologists, and eventually contacted the University of Virginia, the only place in the world specializing in this phenomenon. They began to study the boy's statements as reliable information. As a result, they found an island matching his description. A very small island, like a tiny seed husk in the ocean, near the coast of Scotland. It is called the Isle of Barra. The child was taken there, and he became incredibly excited. He immediately ran toward a house, as if without the slightest doubt, as though he had been there 100 times. He led his family, scientists, and doctors to a house that perfectly matched his description. All of this was filmed in a documentary. If you don't believe what I'm telling you, you can watch it. There is a documentary, Channel 5, 2006, released in Britain, also shown on BBC. And indeed, in that house lives the Robertson family exactly as he had described. Yes, right on the beach of that island, a small plane does land on the sand to supply the island. Yes, on that island there is a black and white dog belonging to the Robertson family. The layout of the rooms and so on matched completely, except for one detail. In the Robertson family, no child had ever died in a car accident. At least, nothing of the kind has ever been established. This is one of those unclear partial matches which occur quite often. Not in all cases do the child's statements about a previous life align completely. Partial matches are very common, and there are also cases, a fairly large percentage, where nothing matches at all. No one has any idea what the child is talking about. If a child describes a supposed previous life, sometimes absolutely no one knows what he means. In other words, there can be any kind of combination in this phenomenon. It is also worth noting a number of very interesting observations. First of all, there is no genetic connection. In other words, we cannot conclude that the child born is in some way a close or distant relative of the deceased. But there are, again not in every case yet quite often, easily noticeable external resemblances between the deceased and the reincarnated child. And here is what is most interesting. Not a single case has ever been documented where the death of the previous person, the one who, so to speak, passed their soul further along the chain, if we follow this logic, occurred after the child's conception. In other words, in 100% of cases, without exception, the child was conceived only after the previous person had died, whether in a catastrophe or from natural causes. That is, the claim that a soul enters the body at conception, in principle, receives some scientific confirmation. I understand that for many of you, everything I have just presented is astonishingly strange, and your natural reaction will be, this cannot be, because this can never be. That was my first reaction when many years ago I learned about this kind of phenomenon. Nevertheless, we must remove the blinders from our eyes and go where the scientific evidence leads us. If you consider yourself a person of science, then the approach to any observed problem, it is impossible because it can never be, is unscientific. It is a blinder. The scientific approach forces us to find an explanation for any phenomenon, however uncomfortable it may be in relation to our established life, philosophical or scientific knowledge. So we have, without a doubt, a fairly large number, thousands of pieces of evidence, testimonies if you will, that information about a previous life by unknown material carriers gets into the head, into the brain of another person, usually a child, in many cases years later. There is no material carrier, molecular, atomic, energetic, in this situation. In principle, such a transfer of information does not exist. Moreover, we observe that not only information is transferred or migrates or is transported, but in all cases without exception, the person, especially the child, perceives themselves as the previous individual. They have a dual character. To a large extent, their behavior, their character, their phobias, sometimes even physical defects or birthmarks coincide with the previous life. So we are talking about more than the transfer of information at a distance. We are talking about the transfer of some personal qualities, essentially that which forms us as a person. We are not yet using the word soul. We do not know what that is. I only draw your attention to the fact that it is not only information. That is, I know a man who in a previous life was a carpenter. I will tell you about him. No, I was a carpenter in a previous life. I dropped an axe on my foot. I died of gangrene. And now in this life I do this, that, and the other. And it is very difficult for people, especially those who did not outgrow their childhood attachment to a previous life. I've told you about many in their department. They retain a double personality, especially those who ended up in the wrong gender. We have no idea how this transmigration occurs, but to deny that the transmigration of souls is a scientific fact is becoming increasingly impossible. Since modern science completely denies the concept of rebirth or reincarnation, and you will not find anything that even attempts to explain this strange phenomenon that we evidently observe, we will have to turn to three well-known religions that have spent many centuries, even millennia, studying this phenomenon. So, Hinduism, one of the oldest religions, regards the concept of rebirth as entirely natural and normal. Atman, that is the soul from the Hindu point of view, is eternal, immutable, independent of the body. It passes through many lives, and this is called the wheel of rebirth, samsara. Karma is the law of cause and effect. Every action, thought, intention leaves a trace that determines the circumstances of your future life. I remind you that for Hindus, you can be reborn as any other being, not necessarily as a human. During my years living in California, I acquired several friends originally from India who are vegetarian, and when I ask them why they deprive themselves of meat, they say, "You never know whom you are eating. It might be your Aunt Sarah who died 5 years ago and was reborn as this chicken. Who can say?" Therefore, it is truly disgusting and repulsive for them to eat flesh, because relatives, or maybe not relatives, but in general someone's soul, could be there. Moreover, they do not eat root vegetables. After all, you can dig up a potato with a spade, cutting a little worm, and that worm is your great-grandfather Isia. In addition, many of them do not cut their hair, and what does hair have to do with it? They pluck facial hair with a little stick, but they do not cut the hair on their head at all. When I learned about this, I asked, "And why is that? What if there are lice, and when you cut your hair or shave, you have killed some louse?" I, with sarcasm, asked, "Listen, doesn't the soul reincarnate into microbes and bacteria?" Well, in general, they did not engage with me in such an erudite discussion. I simply mean that their view of things substantially determines their social and dietary behavior. The main goal of life and the moral compass is to attain liberation. They call it moksha, that is, to exit the cycle of rebirth and merge with absolute reality and the universal spirit. In other words, to join something big that one might call, in some sense, God. Again, I am merely retelling their views. I am not saying whether I believe it or not. It's just interesting what other people have come up with in this direction. In any case, return to this life is considered a punishment. The better the being you return as, the fewer your punishments. Absolute liberation, achieved through a perfectly lived life, means you finally do not return to this path, but instead merge with some kind of absolute universe. Buddhism, it seems to me, is more interesting in light of the information I have just presented. In Buddhism, there is no concept of an eternal soul. They say that the soul may reincarnate, or it may not. That is, it might remain somewhere out there, in an undefined state. Personality is understood as a combination of 5 essential aggregates called skandhas. These are form, the body, feeling, consciousness, that which carries over, perception, and volition. In conclusion, we arrive at some obvious insights. Without a doubt, there exists a huge amount of testimony allowing us to conclude that in very rare cases, compared with the number of the dead, the rarest of cases, there is a transmigration of consciousness. This is not only information, it is also behavior, sometimes biological markers, and psychology. In other words, the transmigration of one person's consciousness into the body of another person has been documented many times. Nobody can deny that anymore. Second, there is no scientific explanation for how this process occurs, and scientific research in this area is practically not being conducted. Why is it not being conducted? Because it undermines the fully formed scientific consensus about a material universe, which originates, strangely enough, in Marxist-Leninist philosophy. Third, the only accumulated informational bases are those of certain Eastern traditions and, in the European world, the Jewish religion, which attempts to generalize this information. And their common consensus is that one soul can transmigrate an infinite number of times, and that reincarnation is more of a punishment than a reward. From there, they build philosophical justifications for why the soul exists. All three hold a concept of a certain energetic field to which souls join, those that do not return to this earth but are pure or holy, or who have lived an ideal life, and so on. Each of these three religions has its own understanding of a perfect, radiant, energetic field, though they call it by different names. I will continue this theme in my next videos, but for today, goodbye. See you next time.